The gunshot that echoed through the valley sent a flock of startled birds into the cerulean Colorado sky, but Eleanor Grayson didn't flinch. After 3 days of running, fear had become a constant companion, as familiar as the growling of her empty stomach and the blisters on her feet. She stumbled forward, her once fine dress now tattered and caked with dust, the hem dragging through the scrubby grass as she made her desperate way toward Pueblo, Colorado. It was 1878, and Eleanor had left everything behind in Denver: her position as a schoolteacher, the few possessions she'd managed to accumulate, and the reputation she'd worked so hard to build. All of it sacrificed to escape the man who'd sworn to possess her, one way or another. Sheriff Harlan Dixon wasn't the type of man who accepted rejection gracefully. When Eleanor had refused his proposal of marriage, his charm had quickly given way to obsession. His badge made him powerful, and that power had made him dangerous. Now, he was tracking her like an animal, determined to bring her back or make sure no one else could have her. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she forced her exhausted body to run faster. The terrain ahead sloped downward, revealing the scattered buildings of Pueblo nestled in the valley below. Freedom seemed tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. Her foot caught on a rock, sending her tumbling down the hillside. She rolled helplessly, pain lancing through her body as rocks and brush tore at her skin. When she finally came to a stop, the world spun around her. She tried to stand, but her ankle buckled beneath her weight, sending a searing pain up her leg. "No," she whispered, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "Not now. Please, not now." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her blood run cold. Sheriff Dixon was closing in. She crawled toward a cluster of boulders, desperate for any hiding place, but knew it was futile. The open terrain offered little concealment, and she couldn't move quickly enough to reach the safety of town. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, the thunder of different hoofbeats approached from the direction of Pueblo. A lone rider appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun, pushing his horse hard up the slope. The stranger wore a wide-brimmed hat and a dusty duster that flapped behind him like wings as he rode. Eleanor held her breath, uncertain whether to call out for help or stay hidden. This new arrival could be Dixon's deputy or another threat entirely. In her experience, men were seldom saviors. The rider spotted her and changed course, heading directly toward her position. As he drew closer, Eleanor could see his face partially shadowed by his hat, a strong jaw dusted with stubble, sharp eyes scanning the terrain. He reined his horse to a stop several feet away and dismounted in one fluid motion. "Madam." His voice was deep but gentle, tinged with concern. "You appear to be in some trouble." Before Eleanor could respond, another shot cracked through the air, sending up a spray of dirt just feet from where they stood. The stranger's reaction was immediate. He drew his revolver and placed himself between Eleanor and the direction of the gunfire. "Get down," he ordered, guiding her behind the meager shelter of a boulder. "He's coming for me," Eleanor gasped, clutching her injured ankle. "Sheriff Dixon from Denver, he won't stop." The stranger's eyes narrowed as he peered over the rock. "A sheriff? Why's he shooting at you?" "Because I refused him," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. "He said no woman rejects Harlan Dixon. He'll either force me to marry him or make sure I never marry anyone." The man's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he said, checking his revolver before turning to his horse. He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a Winchester rifle. "Can you shoot?" Eleanor nodded. Though raised a lady, her father had believed every woman should know how to defend herself in these territories. "Good," he said, handing her the revolver. "If I don't come back, head to Pueblo. Ask for Judge Wilson. He's a fair man, he'll hear you out." "Wait," Eleanor called as he prepared to move out. "Who are you?" He paused, looking back at her with eyes the color of the sky after a storm. "Garrett Blackburn," he said. "Most folks just call me Blackburn." With that, he was gone, moving with the practiced stealth of a man accustomed to danger. Eleanor clutched the revolver, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. The distant figure of Sheriff Dixon was visible now, making his way cautiously down the hillside, rifle in hand. Minutes stretched like hours as Eleanor waited, straining to hear any sound over the pounding of her heart. Then came 3 rapid shots, followed by a cry of pain. She held her breath, terrified of what might have happened. More gunfire. A shout. Silence. Eleanor tightened her grip on the revolver, preparing for the worst. Footsteps approached from behind the boulder. She raised the gun with trembling hands. Garrett Blackburn reappeared, a small cut on his cheek but otherwise unharmed. "It's over," he said simply, holstering his own weapon. "Dixon won't be troubling you anymore. Is he?" Eleanor couldn't finish the question. "Dead?" "No, wounded in the shoulder and disarmed. I've tied him to his horse and sent it back toward Denver with a note explaining his crimes." Garrett knelt beside her, his eyes softening as he noticed her injured ankle. "Now, let's see about getting you to town and having that looked at." Eleanor felt the last of her strength drain away, relief and exhaustion washing over her in equal measure. "Why would you help me?" "You don't even know me." Garrett carefully examined her ankle, his touch surprisingly gentle for such weathered hands. "Out here we help folks in trouble. It's the code of the West." He glanced up, a faint smile touching his lips. "Besides, any woman brave enough to defy a corrupt lawman is worth helping in my book." As he helped her to her feet, supporting her weight against his solid frame, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest hope. Perhaps Pueblo would offer the fresh start she so desperately needed. What she couldn't know then was how deeply entwined her fate would become with the quiet, enigmatic man who had just saved her life. Garrett Blackburn, a man with secrets of his own and a past he rarely spoke of, would come to mean more to her than she could possibly imagine on that fateful day in the Colorado wilderness. The doctor's office in Pueblo was a simple 2-room affair on the main street, wedged between the general store and the town's only hotel. Dr. Samuel Harper, a kindly man with spectacles and a shock of white hair, tutted disapprovingly as he examined Eleanor's ankle. "A bad sprain, but not broken," he declared, wrapping it tightly with bandages. "You're lucky, Miss Grayson. A few more days of walking on it and you might have done permanent damage." Eleanor sat on the edge of the examination table, her tattered dress making her feel desperately out of place in the clean, orderly room. "How long before I can walk properly again, with rest and keeping weight off it?" "A week, maybe 2, doctor." Harper glanced at Garrett, who leaned against the doorframe, hat in hand. "She'll need somewhere to stay, Blackburn. The hotel's full up with those mining investors from back east." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Miller at the boarding house might have a room. I'll check after we're done here." The doctor finished his ministrations and handed Eleanor a pair of wooden crutches. "These should help you get around. Take it slow, and come see me in 3 days." Outside, the evening air had grown cool as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains. Garrett helped Eleanor navigate the crutches down the doctor's front steps and onto the boardwalk that ran the length of Pueblo's main street. "I have no money," Eleanor admitted quietly, the weight of her situation settling heavily upon her shoulders. "I left everything behind in Denver." Garrett didn't miss a beat. "We'll figure something out. Pueblo's a growing town, always need for good people willing to work." They made their way slowly down the street, lamplight spilling from windows onto the dusty road. The town was quieter than Denver, but still bustled with activity. A piano played somewhere in the distance. Horses nickered softly at hitching posts, and the murmur of conversations drifted from the saloon. "What did you do in Denver?" Garrett asked, matching his pace to her halting progress. "I was a school teacher," Eleanor replied, focusing on managing the unfamiliar crutches. "Before that, I taught in St. Louis. I came west after my parents died, thought I might find a new beginning, and instead found trouble in the form of Sheriff Dixon." Eleanor nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "He seemed charming at first, respectable. By the time I saw beneath the facade, he'd already decided I belonged to him." She paused, the memory making her shudder. "When I refused his proposal, he became different. Threatened to ruin my reputation if I didn't reconsider. Said no one would believe a woman over the town sheriff." Garrett's expression darkened. "Men like that are a disgrace to the badge." "You know something about badges?" Eleanor asked, noting the edge in his voice. A faint smile touched his lips. "Let's just say I've had my share of dealings with lawmen, good and bad." Before she could inquire further, they arrived at a tidy 2-story house with a sign reading, "Miller's Boarding House." A warm glow emanated from the windows, and the scent of fresh baked bread wafted through the evening air. Mrs. Miller turned out to be a plump, energetic widow in her 50s, with a no-nonsense manner that somehow managed to be kind. She took one look at Eleanor's bedraggled state and ushered her into the kitchen while Garrett explained the situation. "Of course she can stay," Mrs. Miller declared, setting a bowl of stew in front of Eleanor that made her mouth water. "I've got a room on the ground floor, no stairs to worry about with that ankle. As for payment," she waved a dismissive hand, "we can discuss that once you're back on your feet." "I couldn't possibly," Eleanor began, but Mrs. Miller cut her off. "Nonsense. Any woman running from the likes of Harlan Dixon deserves a helping hand. His reputation travels, you know." She shot Garrett a meaningful look. "Besides, I could use some help around the place. My arthritis isn't getting any better, and I've been thinking of hiring someone." Relief washed over Eleanor, along with a gratitude so profound she found herself blinking back tears. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness." "You can start by eating that stew before it gets cold," Mrs. Miller said briskly. "Skin and bones you are." "Can't have that." While Eleanor ate, the first proper meal she'd had in days, Garrett and Mrs. Miller spoke in low tones by the door. Eleanor caught fragments about keeping an eye out and word from Denver, which sent a chill through her despite the warm food. When Garrett returned to the table, his expression was unreadable. "I've got to head out," he said. "Mrs. Miller will get you settled. I'll check on you tomorrow." "Mr. Blackburn," Eleanor called as he reached the door. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." He paused, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight. "Garrett," he corrected gently, "and no thanks needed. Like I said, it's what we do out here." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Mrs. Miller bustled about, preparing the ground floor room and chattering about town gossip, but Eleanor found her thoughts returning to the quiet cowboy who had risked his life for a stranger. There was something about him, a depth behind those storm-blue eyes, a story untold. Later, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, clean but still aching from her ordeal, Eleanor wondered what the morning would bring. She had escaped Dixon for now, but for how long? And who exactly was Garrett Blackburn, the man who had appeared like an answered prayer on that hillside? Sleep claimed her before she could ponder these questions further, her exhausted body finally surrendering to rest in this unexpected sanctuary. The first rays of dawn streaked through the curtains when Eleanor awoke. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings, the unfamiliar room throwing her into a brief panic before memory returned. Pueblo. Mrs. Miller's boarding house. Safety, at least for now. She tested her ankle gingerly. The pain had dulled to a persistent throb, but Dr. Harper's wrapping held firm. Using the crutches propped beside the bed, she managed to dress herself in a simple cotton dress Mrs. Miller had lent her, slightly too large, but clean and whole, unlike her ruined garments. The boarding house was already alive with activity. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon drew Eleanor to the kitchen, where Mrs. Miller orchestrated breakfast for her handful of boarders, 2 railway workers, an elderly bookkeeper, and a young woman who worked at the millinery shop. "Ah, there you are, Mrs. Miller exclaimed, ushering Eleanor to an empty chair. "I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away. Not that anyone would blame you after what you've been through." Eleanor murmured her thanks as a plate piled with eggs, bacon, and biscuits appeared before her. The other boarders regarded her with open curiosity, and Mrs. Miller wasted no time with introductions. "This is Miss Eleanor Grayson," she announced. "She'll be staying with us while her ankle heals and helping me around the house." The implication was clear. Eleanor was under Mrs. Miller's protection, and questions about her circumstances were unwelcome. The meal passed with pleasant conversation. Eleanor learned that Pueblo was growing rapidly, its position along both the Arkansas River and the expanding railroad making it an increasingly important hub for commerce. The town had weathered hard times during the Panic of '73, but was now rebounding with new industry and settlers. "The schoolhouse is looking for another teacher," mentioned Martha, the milliner, as she buttered a biscuit. "Miss Perkins is expecting, and her husband wants her to stop working once the baby comes." Eleanor's heart quickened. "A teaching position, here in Pueblo," Martha nodded. "The town's growing so fast they can hardly keep up. More families arriving every month means more children needing schooling." "You should speak with Mr. Wilson. He heads the school board." "The same Judge Wilson that Mr. Blackburn mentioned." "One and the same," confirmed Mrs. Miller, refilling coffee cups. "Ezekiel Wilson wears many hats in this town, Judge, head of the school board, and owns the largest cattle ranch this side of the Arkansas. A good man, fair-minded. If you're qualified, he'll consider you regardless of circumstances." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Teaching was more than just a livelihood to her, it was a calling. The thought of standing before a classroom again, of sharing knowledge and watching young minds blossom, made her almost forget the pain in her ankle. The front door opened, bringing a gust of morning air and the subject of her earlier thoughts. Garrett Blackburn removed his hat as he entered, nodding politely to the table of boarders. "Morning, Mrs. Miller. Miss Grayson." His voice carried the slight raspiness of someone who didn't use it often. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Nonsense," Mrs. Miller declared. "Join us. There's plenty." Eleanor noticed that while Garrett accepted a cup of coffee, he remained standing, his tall frame somehow making the spacious kitchen feel smaller. His eyes found hers, assessing. "How's the ankle this morning?" "Better, thank you," Eleanor replied, suddenly aware of her borrowed dress and hastily arranged hair. "Dr. Harper's care was excellent," Garrett nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I spoke with Judge Wilson last night, told him about your situation." Eleanor tensed. "What exactly did you tell him?" "Just the facts. That Sheriff Dixon abused his position and pursued you against your will, that he fired upon an unarmed woman." Garrett sipped his coffee. "Judge Wilson doesn't hold with that kind of behavior, badge or no badge, and he believed you, just like that." A ghost of a smile touched Garrett's lips. "Let's just say the judge and I have an understanding. He knows I don't exaggerate." The other boarders had fallen silent, listening with undisguised interest. Mrs. Miller, noticing Eleanor's discomfort, clapped her hands briskly. "That's enough gossip for one morning. You'll all be late if you don't get moving." The boarders reluctantly dispersed, leaving Eleanor, Mrs. Miller, and Garrett in the kitchen. Once they were alone, Garrett's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less guarded. "The judge would like to meet you," he said. "When you're feeling up to it. I mentioned you were a teacher back in Denver." "Martha just told me there might be a position at the school," Eleanor said, hope coloring her voice. "There is," Garrett confirmed. "Miss Perkins is expecting, yes, I heard." Eleanor smiled. "I would very much like to apply for the position. I'll let the judge know." Garrett finished his coffee and set the cup down. "In the meantime, I brought something for you." He reached into his coat and produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Figured you might need these, considering you left everything behind." Eleanor unwrapped the package to find a hairbrush, a small mirror, a cake of lavender soap, and most touching of all, a book, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. "I wasn't sure what you liked to read," Garrett said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "The shopkeeper's wife recommended it." Eleanor ran her fingers over the book's cover, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Mrs. Miller watched this exchange with knowing eyes. "Well now, isn't that considerate, Garrett Blackburn? You're full of surprises." A faint flush colored Garrett's weathered cheeks. "Just being neighborly, Mrs. Miller." Hum," the landlady hummed, unconvinced. "And will you be neighborly enough to escort Miss Grayson to see Judge Wilson once she's ready?" "If she'd like," Garrett said, looking to Eleanor for confirmation. "I would appreciate that very much," Eleanor replied, surprised by how much she meant it. After arranging to return the following day, Garrett took his leave. Eleanor watched him go from the kitchen window, his long-legged stride carrying him down the street toward the livery stable where, Mrs. Miller informed her, he worked as a horse trainer and occasional blacksmith. "Known him 2 years now," the older woman said, beginning to clear the breakfast dishes. "Never seen him take such an interest in anyone's troubles before." Eleanor helped gather plates, balancing carefully on her good leg. "He seems very kind." "Kind, yes, and private. Keeps to himself mostly." Mrs. Miller gave her a sidelong glance. "Came to Pueblo about the same time I did. Never speaks of his past, but there's rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Eleanor couldn't help asking. "Some say he rode with a rough crowd once upon a time. Others think he might have worn a badge himself." Mrs. Miller shrugged. "All I know for certain is he's honest, hardworking, and treats people fair. The rest is his business." As they washed dishes together, Eleanor found herself wondering about the enigmatic Garrett Blackburn, what had brought him to Pueblo. What shadows lurked behind those storm-blue eyes? And why had he gone out of his way to help a stranger in distress? These questions occupied her thoughts as she settled into the rhythm of life at the boarding house. Mrs. Miller, true to her word, found small tasks Eleanor could manage while seated mending, shelling peas, polishing silver. The work kept her hands busy and her mind engaged, preventing her from dwelling too long on fears of Sheriff Dixon's possible retribution. That evening, as the other boarders returned from their various occupations, Eleanor sat on the front porch, enjoying the cool breeze and the spectacular sunset painting the Colorado sky in hues of gold and crimson. The wooden crutches leaned against the porch railing, a constant reminder of her temporary limitation. She opened Wuthering Heights, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar story. The book had been one of her favorites as a girl, though it had been years since she'd read it. As she turned the pages, a folded slip of paper fell into her lap. Curious, she unfolded it to find a brief note written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Miss Grayson, Judge Wilson expects us at 10 o'clock tomorrow. I'll come by at 9:30 to escort you. If you need anything before then, I'm staying at the livery. Just send word." G. Blackburn Eleanor traced the flowing script with her fingertip, oddly touched by this small evidence of the man's education. Clearly, there was more to Garrett Blackburn than met the eye, a complexity that intrigued her despite her better judgment. As the last light faded from the sky, Eleanor reluctantly made her way back inside, her thoughts divided between anxiety about tomorrow's meeting with Judge Wilson and curiosity about the quiet cowboy who had so unexpectedly become her champion. Morning arrived with a clarity that only the high desert could provide, the air crisp, the sky an impossible blue. Eleanor had risen early, determined to make the best impression possible on Judge Wilson. Using the items Garrett had given her, she carefully arranged her chestnut hair into a neat bun and donned another of Mrs. Miller's loaned dresses, this one a modest navy blue that, while still slightly large, at least gave her the appearance of propriety. At precisely 9:30, Garrett arrived. He looked different today, his usual work clothes replaced by a clean white shirt, dark vest, and what appeared to be newly polished boots. His unruly brown hair had been tamed somewhat, though a stubborn lock still fell across his forehead. Mrs. Miller appraised him with approval. "My, don't you clean up nicely, Mr. Blackburn." Garrett shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, his hat in his hands. "Judge Wilson keeps a formal office," he explained, then turned to Eleanor. "You look well this morning, Miss Grayson." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, feeling a flutter of nerves. "I appreciate you arranging this meeting." Garrett offered his arm for support as they navigated the porch steps. A buggy waited at the curb, another surprise, as Eleanor had expected to walk. "Borrowed it from the livery," Garrett explained, helping her up into the seat. "Figured it would be easier on your ankle than crutches." The courthouse sat at the north end of Main Street, an imposing structure of red brick that spoke to Pueblo's ambitions. As they approached, Eleanor felt her anxiety mounting. So much depended on this meeting, her future, her safety, her chance at a new beginning. "Are you nervous?" Garrett asked, guiding the horse to a hitching post. Eleanor managed a smile. "Is it that obvious?" Only to someone watching closely. He set the brake and came around to help her down. "The judge can seem intimidating at first, but he's fair. Just be honest with him. Even about why I left Denver, about Dixon." Garrett's expression grew serious. "Especially about that. Judge Wilson needs to know exactly what we're dealing with." The "we" didn't escape Eleanor's notice, nor did the implication that Garrett intended to remain involved in her situation. The thought provided unexpected comfort as they entered the courthouse. Judge Ezekiel Wilson's office reflected the man himself, orderly, substantial, and without unnecessary ornamentation. The judge rose from behind his desk as they entered, revealing himself to be a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed silver beard and penetrating gray eyes. Despite being well into his 60s, he conveyed an impression of robust health and sharp intelligence. "Miss Grayson," he said, his deep voice filling the room, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Please be seated." Eleanor took the offered chair, grateful to take weight off her injured ankle. Garrett remained standing slightly behind her, a quiet presence that somehow bolstered her confidence. "Mr. Blackburn has told me something of your situation," the judge continued, resuming his seat. "But I'd like to hear it from you, if you don't mind." Taking a deep breath, Eleanor recounted her story, her position as a teacher in Denver, Sheriff Dixon's initial courtesy giving way to possessiveness, his proposal and her refusal, the escalating threats, and finally her desperate flight. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, determined to present the facts as they had occurred. Judge Wilson listened without interruption, his expression grave. When she had finished, he sat in silence for a moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Sheriff Dixon has a reputation that extends beyond Denver," he said finally. "Not a good one, I might add. There have been incidents with other women, nothing that ever came to formal charges, but rumors persist." "He told me no one would believe me over him," Eleanor said quietly. The judge's eyes hardened. "That, Miss Grayson, is where he was mistaken. I've already sent inquiries to colleagues in Denver. If what you say is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, Dixon's days as sheriff may be numbered." Relief washed over Eleanor, followed quickly by apprehension. "Will that stop him?" He seemed obsessed. "Perhaps not immediately," the judge admitted, "which is why I suggest you remain in Pueblo for the time being. As it happens, we have need of someone with your qualifications." He withdrew a folder from his desk drawer and opened it. "Your references from the Denver School Board are exemplary. Before that, you taught in St. Louis for 3 years with similar commendations. You're educated, experienced, and by all accounts, dedicated to your profession." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "Does that mean?" "It means, Miss Grayson, that I would like to offer you the position at our school, beginning as soon as your ankle permits. Miss Perkins will remain until the end of the month, which should allow for a smooth transition." Joy bubbled up inside Eleanor, momentarily overshadowing all her troubles. "Thank you, Judge Wilson. I won't disappoint you." "I'm certain you won't." The judge smiled, softening his austere features. "Now, as to the matter of your safety. Until we're certain Dixon no longer poses a threat, I think it prudent to take precautions." "I've been keeping an eye on the boarding house," Garrett spoke up, "and I've asked some trusted friends to watch the roads into town." Judge Wilson nodded approvingly. "Good. Additionally, I'll speak with Marshal Reed about increasing patrols near the school and Mrs. Miller's boarding house." He turned back to Eleanor. "You found yourself a determined protector in Mr. Blackburn. I suggest you heed his advice regarding safety matters." The meeting concluded with details about her teaching duties and salary, a sum that, while modest, would allow Eleanor to pay Mrs. Miller and eventually secure her own accommodations. As they prepared to leave, Judge Wilson addressed Garrett directly. "A word, Blackburn, before you go." Garrett nodded, then turned to Eleanor. "Wait for me in the hall. This won't take long." Curious but not wanting to intrude, Eleanor thanked the judge once more and made her way to the corridor outside. Through the partially open door, she caught fragments of their conversation, something about Denver contacts and keeping alert. The serious tone suggested they were discussing her situation, but there seemed to be more to it, an understanding between the two men that went beyond her current predicament. When Garrett emerged, his expression was unreadable. "Ready?" he asked simply. They left the courthouse in companionable silence, the morning sun now high in the cloudless sky. As Garrett helped her back into the buggy, Eleanor found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested habitual contemplation. "Thank you," she said as they pulled away from the hitching post. "Not just for arranging the meeting, but for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along when you did." Garrett kept his eyes on the road, but a faint smile touched his lips. "I'm glad I was there." "So am I," Eleanor replied softly. As they rode back toward the boarding house, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a tentative unfurling of hope. For the first time since fleeing Denver, she could envision a future here in Pueblo, teaching at the school, building a new life, perhaps even finding friends. It was more than she had dared to hope for just days ago. And if her thoughts lingered on the quiet, enigmatic man beside her, on his unexpected kindness and the mysteries he carried, well, that was something to consider another day. For now, it was enough to know that she was safe, employed, and no longer alone in her troubles. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor settled into life in Pueblo. Her ankle healed steadily, allowing her to discard the crutches for a cane, and finally to walk unassisted, though she still favored her right leg slightly when tired. Mrs. Miller proved to be not just a landlady but a friend, introducing Eleanor to the town's respectable matrons and vouching for her character. The story of her flight from Sheriff Dixon had spread. Of course, little remained secret in a town the size of Pueblo, but rather than facing suspicion, Eleanor found herself the recipient of widespread sympathy. Dixon's reputation, it seemed, had preceded him even here. The school where Eleanor would teach was a simple one-room building on the edge of town, currently presided over by Miss Perkins, a cheerful young woman whose advancing pregnancy made her glad of Eleanor's arrival. The students, ranging in age from 6 to 16, regarded their new teacher with the wariness children always reserve for unknown adults. But Eleanor's gentle manner and genuine interest in their progress soon won them over. Through it all, Garrett Blackburn remained a quiet but consistent presence. He escorted Eleanor to and from the school during her first week of teaching, ostensibly to ensure her ankle didn't trouble her, though they both knew his real concern was her safety. Each evening, he would appear at the boarding house at precisely 6 o'clock, inquiring about her day and sometimes lingering for dinner at Mrs. Miller's insistent invitation. These dinners became a bright spot in Eleanor's days. Garrett spoke little about himself, but proved to be surprisingly well-read and thoughtful, engaging Eleanor in discussions of the books she taught her older students or debating current events with Mrs. Miller's other boarders. He listened more than he talked, his eyes often finding Eleanor's across the table, attentive in a way that made her feel truly heard, a novel experience after Dixon's self-absorbed monologues. It was during one such dinner, nearly a month after her arrival in Pueblo, that news came from Denver. Judge Wilson arrived at the boarding house just as they were finishing the meal, his expression grave enough to silence the table's chatter immediately. "Miss Grayson," he said, accepting Mrs. Miller's offer of coffee, "I've received word from my contacts in Denver. Sheriff Dixon has been removed from office pending an investigation. Several women have come forward with similar accounts to yours, emboldened by your example." Eleanor felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. "That's good news, isn't it?" "Partially," the judge replied carefully. "The investigation is ongoing, but Dixon disappeared before he could be formally charged. He was last seen heading south from Denver 3 days ago." The implication hung heavily in the air. South from Denver could very well mean toward Pueblo. "I see," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. Garrett's chair scraped back as he stood. "I'll alert Marshal Reed and the others. We'll increase watches on the roads." His eyes met Eleanor's, conveying a silent promise. "He won't get near you." Judge Wilson nodded. "I've already spoken with the marshal. He's deputizing additional men for the time being." After the judge departed, an uncomfortable silence fell over the dining room. Eleanor excused herself, needing a moment alone to process this development. She stepped onto the front porch, the cool evening air a balm to her suddenly flushed skin. Footsteps behind her announced Garrett's presence before he spoke. "You all right?" Eleanor gazed out at the darkening street. "I thought it might be over," she admitted. "That I might finally be free of him." "You will be," Garrett said, coming to stand beside her at the porch railing. "One way or another." Something in his tone made Eleanor turn to look at him. "What exactly does that mean, Mr. Blackburn?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "It means Dixon won't hurt you. I won't let him." "And if he tries, what then?" Garrett was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Then he'll answer to me, he said finally, his voice quiet but laced with an unmistakable hardness. Eleanor studied his profile in the fading light. There's more to you than a horse trainer from Pueblo, isn't there? A faint smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. Isn't there more to everyone than what they seem at first glance? You know what I mean, Eleanor persisted gently. Sometimes you speak like someone who's had education, and the way you handled Dixon on the hillside, that wasn't the first time you faced down a man with a gun. Garrett was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. I was a U.S. Marshal once, based out of St. Louis, spent 8 years tracking the worst sort of men across 5 territories. Eleanor absorbed this revelation, pieces falling into place. What happened? His shoulders tensed. I made a mistake, trusted someone I shouldn't have. It cost lives. He paused, his grip tightening on the porch railing. I resigned before they could fire me, came west, tried to start over. As a horse trainer in Pueblo. Horses are simpler than people, Garrett said with a shrug. They don't lie, don't betray you. Eleanor felt a deep sadness for whatever wounds he carried. Is that why you helped me? Because of what you used to be? Garrett turned to face her fully, his expression softening. I helped you because you needed helping, because what Dixon was doing was wrong. He hesitated, then added more quietly, and maybe because when I saw you on that hillside, something told me you were worth the trouble. The simple honesty of his words touched something in Eleanor. Before she could respond, however, the boarding house door opened, spilling lamplight onto the porch as Mrs. Miller appeared. There you are, she said, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she looked between them. Eleanor, dear, Martha has a dress she thinks might fit you better than my old things. She'd like you to try it on. The moment broken, Eleanor nodded. Of course. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. As she turned to go inside, she paused beside Garrett. For what it's worth, she said softly, I'm glad you were once a marshal. I'm even more glad you were on that hillside when I needed you. The warmth that bloomed in his eyes stayed with Eleanor long into the night, a counterpoint to the renewed anxiety about Dixon's disappearance. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone, and that knowledge brought a comfort she hadn't expected to find in this dusty Colorado town. The next morning dawned overcast, unusual for Pueblo, with heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. Eleanor set out for the schoolhouse earlier than usual, determined not to let fears about Dixon disrupt her routine or her responsibilities to her students. The school day passed without incident, though Eleanor found her attention wandering to the windows more often than she would have liked, scanning the surroundings for any sign of trouble. Her students, sensitive to her mood, were unusually subdued, and she made an extra effort to smile and engage them despite her distraction. As the final bell rang and the children gathered their slates and books, the sky opened, releasing a sudden deluge that sent them scurrying for home with shrieks of surprise and delight. Eleanor lingered in the doorway, watching the rain transform the dusty street into mud within minutes. She had brought no umbrella, not expecting such weather. Looks like you could use a ride. Eleanor turned to find Garrett approaching under the shelter of a wide-brimmed slicker, leading a horse with a second slicker draped over his arm. The sight of him, water dripping from his hat brim, brought an involuntary smile to her face. My knight in slightly damp armor, she said, accepting the offered slicker. How did you know? Mrs. Miller mentioned you hadn't taken an umbrella. He helped her don the oversized garment. Thought I might save you from drowning on your walk home. The ride to the boarding house was a silent one, the drumming of rain on their slickers making conversation difficult. Garrett's solid presence behind her in the saddle, was both reassuring and disquieting, the closeness necessary for sharing the horse, creating an intimacy that Eleanor found herself unexpectedly enjoying. Mrs. Miller met them at the door with towels and hot tea, tutting over their dampness despite the slickers. "Dreadful weather," she declared. "They're saying it might continue for days. The river's already rising." As evening settled in, the rain showed no signs of abating. The boarders gathered in the parlor after dinner, the usual card games and conversations taking on a cozier atmosphere as thunder occasionally rumbled overhead. Garrett had stayed at Mrs. Miller's insistence that no one should venture out in such weather. Eleanor found herself seated beside him on the small settee, a book open in her lap, though she had read the same page 3 times without absorbing a word. She was acutely aware of his presence, the faint scent of leather and horse, and something uniquely him, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his fingers absently turned his coffee cup as he listened to Mr. Finch, the bookkeeper, expound on the latest news from Washington. "You're quiet tonight," Garrett observed during a lull in the conversation, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Eleanor closed her book, giving up the pretense of reading. "Just thinking." "About Dixon?" "Actually, no," she admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I was thinking about St. Louis, about how different my life might have been if I'd stayed there." Garrett's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you regret coming west?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Despite everything, despite Dixon, I don't regret it. There's a freedom here that I never found in St. Louis, a chance to define oneself by actions rather than background or family connections." "Freedom comes with its own price," Garrett said, his eyes on the rain-lashed windows. "Out here, there's less protection, less certainty." "But more possibility," Eleanor countered. "Isn't that why you stayed after leaving the Marshalls?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Part of it, though I admit Pueblo wasn't my original destination. My horse threw a shoe, the blacksmith offered me work while I waited for repairs, and somehow I never left." "I'm glad you didn't," Eleanor said softly, then felt her cheeks warm at the admission. Garrett's eyes found hers, something unspoken passing between them. "So am I." The moment was interrupted by a pounding at the front door, so forceful that several of the boarders jumped in alarm. Mrs. Miller rose to answer it, but Garrett was faster, motioning for her to stay back as he approached the door cautiously, one hand near his hip where Eleanor knew he carried his revolver. "Who's there?" he called. "Marshal Reed," came the reply, barely audible over the rain. "Open up, Blackburn." Garrett unlocked the door to reveal the town marshal, drenched despite his slicker, his expression urgent. "There's trouble," he said without preamble. "The river's flooding. We're evacuating the lower streets." The peaceful evening dissolved into activity. The boarding house, situated on higher ground, was in no immediate danger, but Mrs. Miller immediately began preparing to receive evacuees. Eleanor and Martha helped rearrange the parlor to accommodate extra bedding, while the male boarders assisted Garrett and Marshall Reed in moving furniture to create more space. As they worked, Eleanor overheard fragments of conversation between Garrett and the marshal, something about the danger increasing if the rain continued through the night, about men needed to reinforce the sandbagging efforts along the riverfront businesses. "I'll go," Garrett was saying. "Just let me make sure things are settled here first." Eleanor approached them, arms full of blankets from the linen closet. "Is there anything else we can do to help?" Marshal Reed, a weather-beaten man in his 40s with kind eyes, shook his head. "You're already doing it, madam. We'll need places for folks to stay dry tonight." He turned back to Garrett. "Meet us at the river in 20 minutes if you can. Every hand helps." After the marshal departed, Garrett helped Eleanor distribute the blankets. "I need to go," he said, his expression apologetic. "People down by the river, of course," Eleanor interrupted. "Go, we'll manage here." He hesitated, clearly torn between duties. "Dixon is unlikely to appear in the middle of a flood," Eleanor pointed out reasonably. "Besides, I'll be surrounded by people all night. I couldn't be safer." Garrett still seemed reluctant, but the urgency of the situation won out. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised, reaching for his still damp slicker. On impulse, Eleanor caught his hand before he could turn away. "Be careful," she said softly. Something flickered in his eyes: surprise, warmth, and something deeper that made her heart beat faster. His fingers tightened briefly around hers. "I will." Within the hour, the boarding house began filling with displaced families from the lower streets. Mrs. Miller orchestrated the chaos with remarkable efficiency, assigning spaces, distributing hot drinks and blankets, and offering reassurances to frightened children and worried parents alike. Eleanor found herself naturally gravitating toward the children, organizing simple games and telling stories to distract them from the storm and their disrupted evening. Her teaching experience served her well, as she kept a dozen youngsters engaged while their parents helped arrange accommodations or spoke in worried clusters about the rising water. It was well past midnight when the door opened again, admitting a group of exhausted, mud-splattered men, among them Garrett. Eleanor felt a rush of relief at the sight of him, though it was quickly tempered by concern at his evident fatigue and the grim set of his jaw. He made his way to where she sat with a now sleeping child in her lap. "The river's still rising," he said quietly, dropping to a crouch beside her. "We've managed to protect most of the businesses on Front Street, but some of the outlying farms are already underwater. Any casualties?" Eleanor asked, gently shifting the sleeping child to a pallet beside his sister. "None so far, thank God, but it's going to be a long night." He ran a hand through his wet hair, leaving it standing in unruly spikes. "I need to go back out soon." Eleanor frowned at the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. "You need rest. Later," he said dismissively. "There's too much to do." She recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and knew argument would be futile. Instead, she rose and led him to the kitchen, where she poured him coffee and insisted he eat something before returning to the river. As he wolfed down bread and cold meat, Eleanor found herself studying him, the strength evident even in his weariness, the determination that drove him to help strangers in need. It struck her suddenly that this was the true measure of the man, not his past as a marshal, but his present willingness to give himself entirely to the welfare of others. "What?" Garrett asked, noticing her scrutiny. Eleanor shook her head, smiling slightly. "I was just thinking that Pueblo is fortunate to have you, Mr. Blackburn." A flush that had nothing to do with exertion touched his cheeks. "I'm just doing what needs doing." "Yes," she said softly. "You always seem to." Their eyes held for a moment, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of feelings growing too strong to be dismissed as mere friendship. Before either could speak, however, a commotion arose from the parlor, raised voices, a child's frightened cry, and then Mrs. Miller calling Eleanor's name with uncharacteristic alarm. They rushed from the kitchen to find the front door standing open, rain gusting in as Mrs. Miller struggled with a man whose sodden appearance couldn't disguise his identity. Sheriff Harlan Dixon stood in the boarding house foyer, his once immaculate uniform mudded and torn, his face haggard but his eyes burning with the same obsessive light Eleanor remembered all too well. "Where is she?" he demanded, pushing past Mrs. Miller. "I know she's here." "Eleanor." Time seemed to slow as his gaze found her, a terrible smile spreading across his face. "There you are, my dear. Time to come home." Garrett moved with the speed that had once made him a formidable lawman, placing himself between Eleanor and Dixon. "She is home," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not welcome here, Dixon." Dixon's hand moved toward his hip, but froze as he registered the revolver already in Garrett's hand, leveled steadily at his chest. "This doesn't concern you, stranger." "I'm making it my concern," Garrett replied evenly. "Now, you have two choices. Walk back out that door and leave Pueblo tonight, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing, harassment, and whatever other charges Judge Wilson can think of." Dixon's eyes narrowed, calculating. The room had gone silent, the evacuees pressing back against the walls, mothers clutching children close, men watching warily. "You have no authority here," Dixon sneered, though Eleanor could see uncertainty creeping into his expression as he noted the hostile faces surrounding him. "I'm still a lawman, not anymore," Garrett cut him off. "Words reached us about your dismissal. The only thing waiting for you in Denver is a jail cell." Something dangerous flashed in Dixon's eyes. "You think I care about that? I came for her." His gaze fixed on Eleanor with unsettling intensity. "She belongs with me. She always has." Eleanor felt a familiar fear rising within her, but alongside it came something new: anger. This man had terrorized her, forced her to flee her home, and now threatened the peace she had found in Pueblo. The thought of him disrupting not just her life, but the lives of everyone in this room, Mrs. Miller, the children she'd been comforting, and especially Garrett, kindled a courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I belong to no one, Harlan," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her pounding heart. "Certainly not to you. I've made a life here a good one. You have no place in it." Dixon's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful, that's enough," Garrett interrupted, his revolver unwavering. "Marshal Reed will be back soon. I suggest you be gone before he arrives." For a tense moment, Dixon seemed to consider his options, his hand still hovering near his own weapon. Then, with a suddenness that made several people gasp, he lunged forward, not toward Eleanor, but at Garrett, attempting to knock the gun from his hand. Garrett sidestepped, using Dixon's momentum against him. They crashed into the wall, grappling for control of the revolver. Women screamed. Children began crying, and Eleanor found herself being pulled back by Mrs. Miller's strong hands as the two men fought. Despite his fatigue from hours of flood work, Garrett quickly gained the upper hand, pinning Dixon face first against the wall, the revolver pressed to his temple. "Don't move," he growled. "Not if you want to keep breathing." The front door burst open again, admitting Marshal Reed and two deputies drawn by the commotion. They took in the scene with professional swiftness. "Well now," Marshal Reed said, approaching cautiously, "what have we here?" "Harlan Dixon," Garrett replied, not relaxing his hold. "Formerly of the Denver Sheriff's Office, came looking for Miss Grayson despite knowing his attentions are unwanted." The marshal's eyes narrowed with recognition. "Dixon, heard about you." He nodded to his deputies, who moved forward to take custody of the struggling man. "We'll take him from here, Blackburn." As the deputies secured Dixon with handcuffs, Marshal Reed turned to Eleanor. "Miss Grayson, I assume you'll want to press charges." Eleanor's throat was dry, but she nodded firmly. "Yes, for harassment and threatening behavior." "Good enough for tonight," the marshal said. "Judge Wilson can sort out the rest in the morning." He gestured to his men. "Get him to the jail and watch him. I don't want any trouble." As they dragged Dixon toward the door, he twisted in their grip to look back at Eleanor. "This isn't over," he called, his voice thick with rage. "You'll see. You'll come back to me. You always do." "No, Harlan," Eleanor said quietly. "This time it really is over." The door closed behind them, leaving an echoing silence broken only by the continued drumming of rain and the muffled sobs of frightened children. Mrs. Miller immediately set about restoring order, her brisk commands for hot chocolate and fresh blankets bringing a semblance of normalcy back to the disrupted household. Eleanor found herself trembling now that the confrontation had ended, delayed shock setting in. Garrett holstered his revolver and crossed to her, concern etched in every line of his face. "Are you all right?" She managed a shaky nod. "Yes, thanks to you again." His expression softened. "You did pretty well yourself, standing up to him like that took courage." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Garrett said quietly. "It means doing what needs doing anyway." Eleanor recognized her own words from earlier, returned to her in a moment when she most needed to hear them. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, finding it as solid and warm as the man himself. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." His fingers tightened around hers, the rough calluses of a working man's hand somehow infinitely gentle against her skin. "Always," he replied, the single word holding the weight of a promise. Mrs. Miller appeared beside them, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she glanced at their clasped hands. "If you two are quite finished, there's work to be done," she said, though her tone held more fondness than reproof. "Those children need settling again, and I've got chocolate to make." Garrett reluctantly released Eleanor's hand. "I should get back to the river. The danger isn't past yet." "Of course," Eleanor said, understanding though she wished he could stay. "Be careful out there." A faint smile touched his lips. "I will. And don't worry about Dixon. He'll be facing a judge in the morning, a real one this time." As he donned his slicker once more and headed back into the storm, Eleanor watched him go with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. Whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of something unexpected and precious, something worth fighting for, worth facing down her fears for. With that thought warming her despite the chill of the rainy night, she turned back to help Mrs. Miller with the displaced families, finding strength in being needed and in knowing that, for the first time since fleeing Denver, she truly was home. The storm finally broke at dawn, giving way to a sky washed clean and a sun that promised warmth after the long, wet night. Eleanor, who had snatched only brief moments of rest between caring for the evacuees, stepped onto the porch to breathe in the fresh morning air. Pueblo was transformed by the flood. From the boarding house's elevated position, she could see the Arkansas River, normally contained within its banks, sprawling across the lower parts of town. Water glinted in the early light, reflecting the sky in puddles and impromptu ponds where streets had been the day before. Despite the devastation, there was already movement below, figures wading through shallower areas, boats being poled between buildings, the work of recovery beginning without delay. The resilience of these people, many of whom Eleanor now counted as friends and neighbors, touched her deeply. Mrs. Miller joined her on the porch, pressing a steaming cup of coffee into her hands. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded, gratefully sipping the strong brew. "How bad is the damage? Could have been worse," Mrs. Miller replied pragmatically. "The sandbagging saved most of the businesses on Front Street. Some of the outlying farms got hit hard, though. Folks will need help rebuilding." "I'd like to assist in any way I can," Eleanor said. Mrs. Miller patted her arm approvingly. "I thought you might say that." "There'll be plenty to do once the water recedes." She hesitated, then added, "Word came from Marshal Raid this morning. Judge Wilson will be holding court at noon to deal with Dixon. He'd like you to be there." Eleanor tensed slightly but nodded. "Of course. I need to see this through." "Garrett will escort you," Mrs. Miller continued, a knowing glint in her eye. He stopped by at dawn to check on things here, said he'd return at 11 to take you to the courthouse. He should be resting, Eleanor protested. He was up all night at the river. That man would walk through fire if you needed him, Mrs. Miller interrupted gently. Surely you see that, Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. We've become friends, certainly, Mrs. Miller's laugh cut her off. Friends. My dear, I've been watching men and women dance around their feelings for 40 years. What's between you and Garrett Blackburn is a good deal more than friendship, whether either of you is ready to admit it or not. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Mrs. Miller turned back toward the house. Now come inside and have some breakfast. You'll need your strength for court today. The boarding house gradually emptied as the morning progressed, evacuees returning to check on their homes or joining the cleanup efforts downtown. Eleanor changed into her best dress, one Martha had altered for her, and waited anxiously for Garrett's arrival. He appeared precisely at 11, looking remarkably composed despite his long night of flood work. Only the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. You should be sleeping, Eleanor chided gently as they set out for the courthouse, picking their way around muddy patches in the road. Garrett shook his head. Later. This is more important. Dixon isn't going anywhere, she pointed out. Marshal Reed has him locked up. It's not Dixon I'm concerned about, Garrett said, his eyes meeting hers. It's you. Facing him in court won't be easy. Eleanor appreciated his understanding. No, it won't, but it's necessary. She hesitated, then admitted, I'm tired of being afraid, Garrett, tired of looking over my shoulder. After today, you won't have to, he promised. Judge Wilson isn't a man who tolerates Dixon's kind of behavior. Between your testimony and the charges from Denver, he'll be behind bars for a good long while. They reached the courthouse to find it already crowded despite the flood conditions. News of Dixon's arrival and subsequent arrest had spread through town, and it seemed half of Pueblo had turned out to witness justice being served. Judge Wilson's makeshift courtroom, the regular one being temporarily unusable due to water damage, was set up in the town hall. The judge himself sat behind a massive oak desk, his silver beard neatly trimmed, his expression stern as Dixon was led in by Marshal Reed and a deputy. Eleanor felt her heart race at the sight of her tormentor, but Garrett's solid presence beside her steadied her nerves. She lifted her chin and met Dixon's gaze directly, refusing to show fear despite the hatred smoldering in his eyes. The proceedings were swift and unequivocal. Judge Wilson heard testimony from Eleanor about Dixon's harassment in Denver and his threats upon arriving in Pueblo. Marshal Reed described the scene at the boarding house. A telegram from Denver confirmed that Dixon faced multiple charges there, including abuse of authority and assault. Throughout, Dixon sat in sullen silence, speaking only when directly addressed by the judge. His former arrogance had given way to a seething resentment that made Eleanor shiver, despite the warmth of the crowded room. Finally, Judge Wilson delivered his ruling. Dixon would be held in the Pueblo jail until he could be transported back to Denver to face the more serious charges there. Additionally, he was barred from entering Pueblo County again under penalty of immediate arrest. Furthermore, the judge added, fixing Dixon with a steely gaze, you are hereby ordered to have no contact whatsoever with Miss Eleanor Grayson, not by letter, telegram, or proxy. Any violation of this order will result in additional charges and imprisonment. Is that understood? Dixon's jaw worked as though he were physically restraining himself from speaking. Finally, he managed a curt nod. I require a verbal answer, Mr. Dixon, the judge pressed. Yes, Dixon spat. It's understood. Good. Marshal, remove the prisoner. As Dixon was led away, he twisted to look back at Eleanor one last time. The naked hatred in his expression made her blood run cold, but she held his gaze steadily until he disappeared through the door. Judge Wilson approached after dismissing the court, his stern countenance softening somewhat. "It's over, Miss Grayson," he said gently. "You can get on with your life now." "Thank you, Your Honor," Eleanor replied, meaning it with all her heart, "for everything." The judge nodded, then turned to Garrett. "Blackburn, a word." The two men stepped aside for a brief, private conversation. Eleanor couldn't hear what was said, but noticed Garrett's posture stiffen slightly before he nodded in apparent agreement. When he returned to her side, his expression was unreadable. "Ready to go?" he asked. Outside, the sun had risen high, its warmth beginning to dry the mud-slicked streets. The town bustled with activity as cleanup efforts continued in full force. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "What did Judge Wilson want?" she asked as they made their way back toward the boarding house. Garrett hesitated before answering. "He asked me to accompany the marshal's men when they transport Dixon to Denver next week." Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Why you?" "Because I know Denver, because I have experience with prisoner transport from my marshal days." He met her eyes directly. "And because he trusts me to make sure Dixon reaches his trial." The implication was clear. Judge Wilson wanted someone he could rely on to ensure Dixon didn't escape en route or somehow return to threaten Eleanor again. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, surprised by how much the thought of his absence troubled her. "A week, maybe 2, depending on how quickly they process him in Denver." Garrett studied her face. "Will you be all right here?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. "I have the school and Mrs. Miller and friends. And Dixon will be far away facing justice at last." Garrett nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. They resumed walking, but something had shifted between them, an awareness of time passing, of decisions approaching. As they neared the boarding house, Garrett suddenly stopped again. "Eleanor," he said, the rare use of her first name catching her attention immediately. "There's something I need to tell you." The seriousness of his tone made her heart quicken. "What is it?" He gestured to a nearby bench, still damp from the rain but sitting in a patch of warm sunlight. Once they were seated, he seemed to struggle with where to begin. "After I deliver Dixon to Denver," he said slowly, "Judge Wilson has offered me a position. Here in Pueblo." Eleanor asked, confused by his solemn demeanor. Garrett shook his head. "In Denver, working with the territorial courts as a special investigator." Eleanor felt as though the bench had suddenly dropped away beneath her. "Oh," she managed. "That sounds like a good opportunity." "It would mean using my experience again, doing work that matters." His eyes searched hers. "But it would mean leaving Pueblo, leaving her." The words he didn't say hung in the air between them. Eleanor forced a smile. "Well, Denver is certainly fortunate to gain someone of your capabilities. When would you start?" "I haven't accepted yet," Garrett said quietly. Hope fluttered in Eleanor's chest. "Why not? It sounds perfect for you." Garrett's gaze dropped to his hands, clasped loosely between his knees. "Because there's something holding me here. Someone." Eleanor's breath caught. "Garrett. When I found you on that hillside," he continued, his voice low and intense, "I was just passing through, helping a stranger in trouble, but then I got to know you, your courage, your kindness. The way you stepped in to help during the flood, even though you were still healing yourself." He looked up, meeting her eyes with a vulnerability she'd never seen in him before. "I've spent 2 years in Pueblo, Eleanor, but I never felt like I belonged here until you arrived." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to go to Denver if it means leaving you behind." The words came out in a rush, as though he'd been holding them back for too long. "I'm saying that somewhere between that hillside and today, You became the most important person in my life." Emotion welled up in Eleanor, too complex and overwhelming to be contained. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Garrett's expression fell. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have known," Eleanor interrupted, wiping at her tears with trembling fingers. "Don't apologize, it's just I never thought." "What?" he prompted gently when she faltered. "I never thought anyone would choose me," she whispered. "Especially not someone like you, someone so good." Garrett's laugh was soft and incredulous. "Eleanor Grayson, you are the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. How could I not choose you?" He reached out tentatively, his weathered hand covering hers. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, "but I know I want to face it with you if you'll have me." Eleanor turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining. "What about the position in Denver?" "There will be other positions," Garrett said simply, "but there's only one you." The truth of his feelings was written plainly across his face, unguarded and sincere. Eleanor felt something within her unfold in response, a certainty, a recognition of what had been growing between them since that first day on the hillside. "I don't want you to give up an opportunity like that," she said slowly. "Not for me. I'm not giving up anything," Garrett insisted. "I'm choosing what matters most." Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage. What if you didn't have to choose?" "What do you mean?" "Denver has schools too," she pointed out softly. "Good ones. They're always looking for experienced teachers." Understanding dawned in Garrett's eyes. "You would consider coming with me, starting over again." "It wouldn't be starting over," Eleanor corrected him. "It would be moving forward. Together." The smile that spread across Garrett's face was like the sun breaking through clouds, transformative, brilliant with joy. "Together," he repeated, as though testing the word and finding it perfect. On impulse, Eleanor leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Garrett responded with a tenderness that made her heart ache. His hand came up to cradle her cheek, his touch reverent. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "About Denver? About us?" Eleanor smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The truth of it resonated within her. This man, this quiet, honorable, unexpected man, had saved her in more ways than one. He had protected her, respected her, and seen her worth when she'd been too afraid to recognize it herself. "I love you, Garrett Blackburn," she whispered, the words feeling both new and somehow long overdue. "And I would follow you anywhere." His answering kiss was all the response she needed, a promise, a beginning, and a homecoming all at once. 1 year later, Eleanor stood on the porch of a modest house on the outskirts of Denver, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and purple. The autumn air carried a hint of coolness, a preview of the winter to come. So much had changed in 12 months. After Garrett had delivered Dixon to justice in Denver, a journey that had passed without incident, despite Judge Wilson's concerns, they had returned to Pueblo long enough to make arrangements for their move. Mrs. Miller had cried at their departure, but declared herself pleased as punch about their engagement. The children at the Pueblo school had presented Eleanor with a handmade book of drawings and notes that she still treasured. Their wedding had been a simple affair, held in Judge Wilson's garden with Mrs. Miller, Martha, and a few other friends from Pueblo making the journey to Denver for the occasion. Eleanor had worn a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Garrett had looked so handsome in his new suit that she'd barely heard the words of the ceremony, lost in the wonder of becoming his wife. The house they now shared had been Garrett's wedding gift to her, nothing grand, but solid and well-built, with a garden that Eleanor had spent the summer cultivating, and a view of the mountains that never failed to take her breath away. Denver itself was both familiar and strange. Eleanor had avoided her old neighborhood, having no desire to revisit the memories associated with that time in her life. Instead, they had carved out a new existence in a different part of the growing city. Garrett's position with the territorial courts suited him perfectly. His experience as a marshal, combined with his natural integrity, had quickly earned him the respect of judges and lawmen alike. He traveled occasionally to testify in cases or investigate matters for the court, but never for more than a few days at a time. Eleanor had found a position at a new school serving the children of workers at the nearby smelting works. Many were immigrants with limited English, making the work challenging but deeply rewarding. She had introduced innovations in teaching methods that had initially raised eyebrows, but ultimately won the support of parents and the school board alike. Dixon was a shadow that had gradually faded from their lives. He had been convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. Eleanor had testified at his trial, Garrett at her side, and had felt a profound sense of closure when the verdict was announced. She rarely thought of him now, and when she did, it was with pity rather than fear. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her from her reflections. Garrett appeared around the bend in the road, riding at an easy pace, his tall figure relaxed in the saddle. Eleanor's heart lifted at the sight of him, just as it did every time he returned home. He dismounted with the fluid grace that still captivated her, securing his horse at the hitching post before climbing the porch steps to greet her. His kiss was warm and thorough, carrying the familiar taste of coffee and the outdoors. "Missed you," he murmured against her lips. Eleanor smiled, leaning into his embrace. "You were only gone since morning." "Long enough," he countered, his arms tightening around her waist. "How was your day?" "Productive. I finished grading all the composition exercises, and Mrs. Abernathy from next door brought over a jar of her apple preserves." Garrett made an appreciative sound. "For breakfast tomorrow, if you're good," Eleanor teased, leading him inside to the warmth of their home. Their evening routine had the comfortable rhythm of a well-practiced dance, Garrett tending to his horse while Eleanor prepared dinner. Shared stories of their respective days over the meal. Dishes washed together at the sink, and then quiet hours by the fire with books or conversation. Tonight, however, Eleanor had news that would change everything yet again. She waited until they were settled in the sitting room, Garrett in his favorite armchair with a book, she on the small sofa with her mending. "I saw Dr. Bennett today," she said casually, though her heart raced. Garrett looked up immediately, concern crossing his features. "Are you ill?" "Not at all," Eleanor assured him, setting aside her sewing. "Quite the opposite, in fact." His brow furrowed in confusion, then cleared suddenly as understanding dawned. "Eleanor," he breathed, the book forgotten as he leaned forward. "Are you?" She nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. "We're going to have a baby in the spring." The transformation of Garrett's expression was something Eleanor knew she would remember forever, the wonder, the awe, the pure happiness that lit his features from within. In one fluid movement, he was beside her on the sofa, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he repeated, voice thick with emotion. "Our baby," Eleanor nodded, her own eyes wet. "Dr. Bennett says everything looks perfect." April or early May, he thinks. Garrett placed a reverent hand over her still flat stomach. "I never thought." He shook his head, overcome. "I never thought I'd have this. A home. A family. You," Eleanor understood completely. Both of them had walked difficult paths before finding each other, she with her losses and flight from Dixon. He with the burdens of his past and the solitude he had imposed upon himself as penance. "I know," she said softly, covering his hand with her own. Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve such happiness. Garrett's eyes, those same storm blue eyes that had first met hers on a dusty hillside outside Pueblo, held hers with an intensity that still made her breath catch. You existed, he said simply. You were brave and kind and stronger than you knew. You deserved everything good in this world long before I stumbled into your life. Eleanor thought back to that desperate day, to the fear and exhaustion that had nearly overwhelmed her. She remembered her words to him when he'd found her certainty that she wasn't worth the trouble her presence would cause him. I'm not worth the trouble, she'd cried, certain that helping her would only bring danger to this stranger's door. But Garrett had looked at her with those eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, and had said words she would never forget. You're worth everything I have. At the time, she'd thought it merely kind reassurance. Now, she understood it had been a promise one he had kept with every action since, every choice he had made, every moment of their shared life. What are you thinking? Garrett asked, noting her reflective expression. Eleanor smiled, leaning into the solid warmth of him. I was remembering the day we met, how certain I was that you would regret helping me. And I was thinking how lucky I was to find you, he countered, even if I didn't fully realize it at the time. We've come a long way since then, Eleanor murmured. Garrett's hand caressed the slight curve of her stomach where their child grew. And we've got a lifetime still ahead of us. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky outside their window, Eleanor Blackburn felt a contentment so complete it seemed to fill every corner of her being. The road that had brought her here had been difficult, even dangerous at times, but she wouldn't change a single step of it now. For it had led her to this moment, this home, this man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. And now, to the new life, they had created together the ultimate affirmation of the love that had begun with a chance encounter on a Colorado hillside and grown into something more precious than either of them could have imagined. I love you, she whispered, the words both a declaration and a vow. Garrett's kiss was his answer, tender and sure, carrying all the promise of the future stretching out before them, a future they would build together, day by day, choice by choice, love by love. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Garrett would always begin the story the same way. I found your mother on a hillside outside Pueblo, running from trouble and convinced she wasn't worth saving. And Eleanor would always add, with a smile that still made his heart turn over in his chest. And your father told me I was worth everything he had, and every day since, he's proven it true.